Ben, you were really offended by income inequality, right? So I want to touch specifically on that. So if we did what Gene said and rolled back crony capitalism and really had a true clean capitalism where, the intersubjective wants of consumers are honored much more, and we had a radical increase in standards of living because of this, but still had income inequality, does that really matter? Is it just not envy at that point?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part of the question?
Yeah, so if we had much higher prosperity with clean capitalism, but still had income inequality, does it really matter at that point? Why would you still be offended by it?
I got you. Thank you. So yes, I think that first of all, of course, it goes without saying that I don't accept the hypothetical that truly clean capitalism would result in this greater prosperity. In fact, I think in the real life, in numerous ways, every successful market that's ever existed has been propped up by numerous forms of state intervention. That without state-backed currency, without limited liability corporations, without intellectual property protections, all sorts of things that many libertarians object to, I think it's very unlikely that we would have a form of capitalism that was even close to the level of prosperity that we had right now. But even if I did accept the premise, right? So it's an interesting thought experiment. If we had much less poverty, but we still had rampant income inequality, would that still be objectionable? Well, it would certainly be less objectionable because one of the things that's wrong with income inequality is that it results in the coexistence of great wealth and great poverty, and redistribution could solve a lot of that. But that's not the only thing that's wrong with income inequality. Another thing that's wrong with income inequality is that it makes political equality ludicrously impossible because concentrations of wealth in every country that's ever existed always lead to concentrations of political power. Sometimes Americans believe we can campaign finance and reform our way out of it. Not going to happen. Concentrated wealth always leads to concentrated political influence. Another thing that's wrong with economic inequality is that it gives some people much more power over others in workplaces. So yes, I have to say, I find extremely unlikely hypothetical that you just gave me, then I would think that would remove one of my objections to income inequality, at least income inequality as extreme as we have. It certainly wouldn't reject, it certainly wouldn't would remove all of them. And I am very, very curious about how far Gene would actually want to go in removing the state from the economy, and whether he really believes that really removing the state from the economy so we can have some libertarian vision of clean capitalism is going to lead to more prosperity as opposed to realistically quite a bit less.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you for the question, Ben. Briefly, again, I don't know. I didn't invite Paul Krugman. I invited you. With respect to that question, it's a big topic. Obviously, I do believe that under crony capitalism, the rich and powerful are supported. You even seem to believe in regulatory capture. You suggested that clearly, if we weaken the state, if we go back to something like the vision of the founding fathers, we'd have much greater justice in this society because the state is used to protect the powerful. That's the basic nature of the state. You pass laws, you pass regulation, the powerful and the moneyed interest get interested. That, to my mind, is just sort of basic political economy. The only thing I would say, however, in terms of actually relating to the larger question, is that what Ben wants to do is foster a dystopia of greater government power by giving government power basically over all financing, all major allocation of labor, and it would not be even if it is the fantasy of democracy. Clearly, Ben seems to not understand the difference between freedom and democracy. If 51% of the people vote on something that's absolutely anathema, I could make something up, then clearly that's not freedom. 51% of the people vote to crush the freedom of the other 14%, 49%. That's not freedom. And I guess fundamentally, I guess that's where he and I part company. Although I do say that it's a fantasy for him to think that there will be enough hours in the day for any of us to know what's going on with all of the government agencies that are deciding on where the money goes. We can rest assured that the Obamas of this world will make sure that the money does not go to any dissenters whom they don't like. And so, again, he's going to create a society that will take us in all in exactly the opposite direction. I've said, for the sake of the discussion, I'll defend our crony capitalist system, however corrupt it is, against what he's proposing, because clearly what he's proposing would put freedom under siege.
Microphone in the front, please. Ben, you can address that in the summation.
My question is for Ben. First of all, major problems for coming from the crowd that probably the majority would disagree with you. I have to give you credit for that. I want to know what you would define as the means of production, because I am not part of the capitalist class as I think you would define it, and I don't think anybody else in this room is. But we all own things that I would consider to be the means of production, such as our computers, our instruments, our microphones, our phones. And I've never really got a clear answer on what exactly the means of production is. So if you could answer that question for me, please.
Yeah, means of production, and remember that's an abbreviation. Since we're obviously also interested in distribution, exchange, and so on, is a term that refers to things like factories, farms, grocery stores, workplaces, right? It refers to workplaces. Now, of course, socialists have always thought, going back to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels in 1848, right before the term capitalism was even been formulated by Louis Blanc, that personal property is something that people have real rights to. That property that's primarily for personal use is something that should be relatively sacrosanct. We can come up with exceptions, philosopher kind of edge cases, but more or less. Now, is there going to be a blurry line between personal property and property in what would usually be considered the means of production? Are there going to be gray areas? Yeah, of course there are. But we don't want to make the mistaken logical leap from the existence of gray areas between categories to the conclusion that the distinction between the categories doesn't exist or isn't important. You could start out with the gentleman there a few rows up, his head, I'd say, okay, he's bald. We add a hair to his head. Yeah, he's still bald. We add a hair to his head. He's still bald. We add it until he looks like Fabio. And at some point, of course, he has crossed the threshold from being bald to not being bald. Good luck pinning down exactly how many hairs have to be on his head for that threshold to be crossed. But we all think that threshold exists. I think when it comes to laws and regulations, there are numerous real-world examples of distinctions, being made in practice about numbers of employees and so on. Those distinctions are necessarily imperfect, given the nature of human institutions, but I think that they can be drawn in ways that are, if not perfect, at least reasonable.
Microphone in the back.
Building on Ben's response, I would only, again, urge him to recognize that private ownership, the right to private ownership of the means of production, by the way, be it whether you're constructing your firm as a worker-owned firm or wage and salary firm or whatever, the right to that private ownership is essential to freedom, because if you give the government any power over that scarce resource, then they have every excuse to allocate in ways that interest them. That's why we want 100 flowers to bloom. That's why we want not only crowdfunding, why we want investment capital, why we want to end the dominance of the Federal Reserve over banking. We want as many possible avenues whereby people can pursue whatever they want, whether be it creating a deli or a hot dog stand or a printing press or Jacobin magazine. That's essentially the importance of free market capitalism, because capital is a scarce resource. And if you give the government the power to allocate that scarce resource, then that way lies totalitarianism.
Microphone in the back.
All right, this is for Ben. I feel I have a pretty good example with me. I have a small business. I breed cats. But me and my wife have been doing it for a long time. It's not a job that we make a ton of money at, but let's say, for example, my neighbor decided he has a few extra hours in his day. One of the major parts of my job is to spend 2 to 3 hours a day cleaning the cat room, because it's important to make sure they have a clean environment. Let's say they decide to do it. I don't make enough money to be able to pay them above minimum wage. And also in your I mean, not to assume entirely what I would assume in your society that wage and salary wouldn't be amenable. There'd be some rules around it. Let's say just between us, we make some sort of agreement. What should happen to me?
What would actually happen to you if you decided to make an agreement where you're paid less than the minimum wage, or where you violated numerous other labor laws? What should happen to you if you're a libertarian who believes very strongly in property rights? If you own a vacant building and people squatted that, right? What should happen to them? I think in all of these cases, we could recognize that there are ways of enforcing laws that don't involve massive, rampant imprisonment. I think that focus, that we could have very lenient enforcement. We could have fines. We could focus on restorative justice. And I think that's what you would say about enforcing the laws that you like, as somebody who believes in very strongly in property rights. So, for example, wants to use the power of the law to stop those squatters. I think that that's what I would say about enforcing, laws mandating worker ownership. And I think that's what everybody would say about, not everybody, there are extreme libertarians, but everybody else would say about minimum wage laws, sexual harassment laws, and every other labor regulation.
Microphone in the front.
Not to hog the mic, if you don't mind. What if I decide not to pay those fines? What would happen?
I'm sorry,
What if I decided not to pay those fines? What would you think should happen?
Yeah. And again, what if those squatters don't pay those fines, right? What if people who violate any number of laws that you advocate don't pay those fines? Of course, if we live in a society that still has imprisonment as a punishment of last resort, you can come up with scenarios whereby somebody would eventually be imprisoned after every other avenue has run out because they were squatted, because they didn't use their turn signal and they refused to pay the fine for getting pulled over for not using their turn signal, etc. So all of these, anytime you have a law, sure, you can come up with scenarios where that last resort is used. But I think if we're going to be realistic about it, the vast majority of the time, all of these laws are enforced without that. And this objection cuts both ways, to the laws you want to protect your property rights, to the laws that I want to enforce fairness and democracy in the workplace.
I think Ben, again, when he talks about outlawing wage and salary employment, does not appreciate the quantitative magnitude of what he's proposing. 140 million workers, tens and tens of thousands of firms. With respect to sexual harassment and minimum wage laws, it's numerically quite minor and very different.
It's numerically quite minor because we have those laws. It wasn't numerically quite minor before those laws were passed.
Ben, give him a chance to respond.
Ben, you're not allowing me to finish. He doesn't appreciate the potential for the vast amount of anger that he would be engendering by imposing that kind of draconian requirement that people can't get a decent wage and salary job because he doesn't think that this is the sort of thing that they should do with their lives. That kind of arrogant attitude toward the way people should live their lives could engender anger on the part of the 140 million people who do it all the time. So he's really playing with fire when he proposes that. And his analogies don't hold up. He likes history. Historically, those analogies are minor compared to what he wants to take on in terms of the law.
There might be disanalogies. We certainly haven't heard them yet, despite repeated challenges. And the draconian thing being imposed on those workers is that they are allowed, if they choose, to participate in elections at the workplace. That's it. If Gene thinks that most people hate being permitted to vote if they want to so much that there would be somehow, even though this was passed democratically, there would be mass resistance to this, I have not yet tonight heard a reason to take that seriously.
Ben,